When the smoke cleared at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the world assumed war had begun. But behind the scenes, the colonies hesitated. The British had marched out expecting to crush rebellion. Instead, they'd triggered open resistance. Yet, even after blood was spilled, there was no clear call for independence, no national army, just scattered militias, angry pamphlets, and whispers of rebellion. George Washington, still a Virginia planter, hadn't yet been chosen to lead. That would come 2 months later. In the meantime, 13 colonies struggled to agree. Some still wanted peace, others pushed for full war. Secret letters were exchanged. Governors panicked. Merchants worried about losing British trade. Meanwhile, farmers grabbed muskets. Towns built makeshift forts. Boston was surrounded, but no one knew what to do next. It was a time of confusion, courage, and a dangerous pause. Had Britain struck hard then, the revolution might have ended before it truly began. But they didn't, and in that pause, a new nation began to breathe. On April 19, 1775, 700 British soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith set out from Boston to seize colonial military supplies. At Lexington, they confronted 77 Minutemen armed with muskets and determination. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. As the British advanced, a second company of Minutemen joined the fight. By the time the Redcoats reached Concord, their mission was aborted, but they were not defeated. The British suffered heavy losses that day, but they were battle-hardened veterans, supported by the most powerful empire on Earth. The Americans had won a tactical victory, but winning the war would require an army. And without an army, the colonies had no choice but to keep fighting as a rabble. At least that's how Britain's Lord North believed. In reality, the situation was far more complicated. Although the battles of Lexington and Concord were the first military engagements of the American Revolutionary War, the first shots fired in this conflict were those fired by enslaved Africans against their enslavers in the Stono Rebellion of 1739. And while the War for Independence officially began with the battles of Lexington and Concord, it was not until July that the Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. And so, while the immediate aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord left the question of independence still in the balance, there's much to uncover about how this pivotal moment in history actually played out. The battles of Lexington and Concord took place against the backdrop of growing tensions between the American colonies and the British Empire. In the years leading up to the war, the colonies had become increasingly discontent with British rule, particularly with the imposition of new taxes and the growing sense that their rights as Englishmen were being infringed upon. By April 1775, the situation had reached a boiling point, and the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had formed a militia to resist any attempt by the British to suppress the rebellion. When news of the British plan to seize colonial military supplies in Concord reached the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, they called for the militia to assemble at Lexington and Concord to prevent the British from carrying out their plan. As the British advanced from Boston to Concord, they were met with fierce resistance from the colonial militia. At Lexington, a company of Minutemen confronted the British troops, and the first shots were fired, wounding 8 Americans, killing 8 more. The British continued on to Concord, where they were again met with resistance. By the time the British troops reached Concord, their mission to seize military supplies had been aborted, and they began their retreat back to Boston. Throughout the retreat, the British were harassed by colonial militiamen, most famously at the North Bridge in Concord, where the British were again forced to halt their advance. Although the British eventually reached Boston, their retreat was a humiliating one, and the victory was a major boost to colonial morale. In the aftermath of the battles, the colonial leaders met at the Second Continental Congress to discuss the next steps in the conflict. They created a Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. The war for independence was on, but the story doesn't end there. The battles of Lexington and Concord were a pivotal moment in American history, but they were only the beginning of the fight for independence. Over the next 7 years, the American colonists, with the help of their allies, would face off against the mighty British Empire in a struggle that would ultimately change the course of world history. If you want to know more about the story of the American Revolution, stay tuned. When the smoke cleared at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the world assumed war had begun. But behind the scenes, the colonies hesitated. The British had marched out expecting to crush rebellion. Instead, they'd triggered open resistance. Yet, even after blood was spilled, there was no clear call for independence, no national army, just scattered militias, angry pamphlets, and whispers of rebellion. George Washington, still a Virginia planter, hadn't yet been chosen to lead. That would come 2 months later. In the meantime, 13 colonies struggled to agree. Some still wanted peace, others pushed for full war. Secret letters were exchanged. Governors panicked. Merchants worried about losing British trade. It was a political disaster for the crown. And yet the fighting hadn't really stopped. Farmers grabbed muskets. Towns built makeshift forts. Boston was surrounded, but no one knew what to do next. It was a time of confusion, courage, and a dangerous pause. Had Britain struck hard then, the revolution might have ended before it truly began. But they didn't, and in that pause, a new nation began to breathe. This is Lex and Con, the story of the American Revolution told in 100 seconds. When the British regulars arrived in Lexington, they were met by a small group of armed Minutemen. Captain Parker, a British officer, demanded their weapons. But when the sun rose on April 19, 1775, no one could remember where he'd come from or why. All they knew was that the Americans fired and the redcoats ran. But as the dust settled at Concord, another question arose. What now? The answer came that afternoon when British troops retreated to Boston, only to find themselves surrounded by an angry mob. A young lieutenant colonel, William Prescott, ordered them to stop. In an instant, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. As the smoke cleared, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia to decide their next move. There was no national army, just militias from 13 separate colonies with 13 different currencies, not to mention 13 different ways of fighting. But they had one thing in common, a desire for independence. Meanwhile, General Gage, the British commander in Boston, had a completely different plan. He would take out the leaders of the rebellion once and for all. On April 18, 1775, he sent 700 soldiers to Concord to seize colonial weapons. But before they could load up, those same Minutemen returned, forcing the British to retreat to Boston. But the fight for independence had just begun. This is Lex and Con, the story of the American Revolution told in 100 seconds. Every day in April, we'll bring you news stories of the American Revolution, so subscribe now to get more. And be sure to tune into our podcast, Revolution, where we bring to life the stories of the brave men and women who fought for independence.